You've got the newest Headwaters magazine of Water Education Colorado, and this was started in 2002 in the midst of that horrendous drought. And Diane Hoppy of Sterling and Jim Isgar of Hesperus, so we had a nice East Slope, West Slope sponsorship on this bill, authorized a nonpartisan, non-advocacy, statewide water organization. Now, we called it the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, but we now know ourselves as Water Education Colorado. So this is about the 48th Headwaters magazine we've published since 2003. We've published also 10 citizen guides. Some of you are familiar with the Water Education Colorado. Could you put up your hand if you are? Welcome, and the rest of you, I'd like to introduce you to this great organization. The mission is a statewide water organization according to the legislation to help Coloradans reach informed decisions when it comes to water. So we're not in politics. I still serve as a judge. I'm a senior judge doing mediation in the water courts. I'm a co-director of the Natural Resources and Environment program at the University of Denver. And I'm finishing up a book with Dr. Michael Welsh of the University of Northern Colorado, a book on the Union Colony Greeley water history. So I've been busy, but I've been publications chair of Water Education Colorado since 2002. And the judicial canons do allow judges to speak and write, but not get involved in politics. And I can't practice law, so any of you who needs a good lawyer, don't call on me. If you want to ask me a hypothetical, make sure it's a hypothetical. I can't give legal advice, okay? But I'm here really to talk about the history, culture, poetry of water, and I couldn't be in a better place, I think. I really appreciate the president being here. Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be welcomed by you and have you in the audience. I really admire what you're doing. My sister-in-law, Jean Hobbs, attended this great school when she was getting her teacher's training to teach at Pagosa High School. My brother, Will Hobbs, the young adult author, is there on the left, the author of Bearstone, Bear Dance, Downriver, River Thunder, 18 young adult novels, 2 books for children. He's coming out with his most recent book here next year. It's called City of Gold, and it's going to be set in Telluride. So if you've read any of Will's books, they're all adventure stories from being out on the land, a great outdoorsman. And this is Mary Alice Lake at 12,400 feet below Mount Oso up in the San Juans. And of course the San Juans share their presence with the San Luis Valley as well as our great southwestern part of the state. So this is way above timberline. That's my son Dan. He's a Pueblo chili grower and grows garlic, irrigates off the Bessemer in eastern Pueblo County. Always wanted to be a farmer, you know. He grew up in Capitol Hill, and he kept this book called Farm Dream, and he would sketch the farm that he wanted to own someday. Well, he actually bought a farm. We helped him with it on the Pecos River below Las Vegas, New Mexico, and he did that about 5 years, but that's pretty high country, you know, over 7,000 feet. You're very limited what you can grow there. So my wife says it's like putting out the breadcrumbs. He came up and found this farm at Avondale, and that's growing country, huh? 4,000 feet, that's growing country. Thank you, Rio. Yeah. Let me just get the poetry book out of here. Yeah, it's a heavy load, isn't it? Yeah. So we're up on the San Juans here, and I hope you allow me to read you a little poetry here, because I mean it was on the flyer, wasn't it? It was on the advertisement. Okay, all right. I want to be sure of that. All right. So this one is called Colorado, Mother of Rivers. When I was young, the waters sang of being here before I am, of falling sweet and soft and slow, to berry bog and high meadow, and held me in her lap and cooed the willow roots, the gaining pools, and called me through bright dappled grass, and called me, oh, my shining one, and shaped a bed to lay me on, and played a flute so high and clear, and shaped the stones to carry me when I am young and full of fight, for roaring here and roaring there, for pouring torrents in the air. When I am young as mountain snow, in crag and cleft and cracked window, I call the greenback cutthroat trout. I call the nymph and helgramite. I call the hatch to catch a wind. I call upon the mountain track. I call the scarlet to the jaw, as morning calls her own hatchlings. Call Yampa, White, the Rio Grande, San Juan, the Platte, the Arkansas. So I wrote that in celebration of the 30th year of Colorado's end-stream flow law, which was passed in 1973 and allows our Water Conservation Board to appropriate in-stream flows between upstream and downstream points, and then also to acquire water. This is what the Colorado Water Trust does, by lease or sale. Generally, of course, agricultural water rights, as you well know, are the most valuable because they're senior, and use them to augment the junior in-stream flows. So this has been a great innovation in the Colorado water law, along with the kayak course. Now, Gigi, you remember all of this, right? Absolutely. History. Who of you have been around long enough to know Wayne Aspinall and Dick Lamb and Freddie Anderson and Hank Brown? Yeah. Well, those folks were pretty wise, because at the outset of the environmental era, they saw the writing on the wall, and I was being a little facetious about EPA. I love being there. I was an air enforcement attorney. But when J.D. McFarland from Pueblo was elected Attorney General in 1975, I, along with David Robbins, went to the Attorney General's office and started the Natural Resources section. So that's when the true Attorney General's office started, because otherwise the Attorney Generals were hiring outside counsel to do the litigation, and J.D. changed that. A great man from Pueblo, at least. And I really enjoyed working for him for 4 years, and then I went into private practice with Davis, Graham & Stubbs, a Denver law firm, but then immediately got assigned to work for the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. So I was the assistant counsel and the general counsel for those 7 northeastern Colorado counties with the Water Conservancy District until Governor Romer appointed me to the court in April of 1996. Then, under our merit selection system, you have to retire at least by 72. So I'm beyond that. That's all I'm going to say. But then I got a contract with the courts to do mediation for the water courts, to try to settle the cases from the inside. And that's very interesting work. So this is the window. That's right up there on the divide. How many of you have been to this spot? Isn't that something? It's some amazing spot. Of course, this plays centrally in Bearstone and Bear Dance. We're actually on the San Juan riverside of this place, but all you have to do is walk 100 yards over there and you're on the Rio Grande side, all right? So you have, as you know, tremendous geography here in the San Luis Valley. The window. Bearstone, Bear Dance, adventure stories about the last grizzly bear in the San Juan, which comes off a true story. The wilderness areas of Colorado under the 1964 Wilderness Act. Lots of people don't give Wayne Aspinall credit for this, but he deserves credit for the Wilderness Act after he got Glen Canyon Dam authorized through the 1956 Colorado River Storage Project Act and actually under construction. Then we have these wonderful wilderness areas, but notice, there we go, the Weminuche and the South San Juan and the Sangres, Spanish Peaks and All those, they surround your valley, you know. They're wonderful guardians, shields, gateways, magnificent vistas for everybody who comes to visit, watersheds, aquifer rechargers. So this is above Crete, if I remember right. This is probably when we went up there for the Rio Grande Reservoir 100th anniversary, right? So what a wonderful stretch of river that is. And I guess there's, what's that?
Before the fire.
Well, yeah. Okay. By the way, I passed one of those coming down through Salida today, or past Salida on 285. That's something. It was blowing right down on Salida. But a lot of this is now, is it preserved in open space, water conservation easements, some of this?
A lot of the valley floors, yeah.
Valley floor? How about along the river?
That's probably Forest Service.
Forest Service, okay. So you don't need to preserve that because they're doing a good job. 1/3 of Colorado is still in federal ownership, 14 million acres of forest land, 8 million acres of BLM land. Of course, under the Homestead Act, 2/3 of Colorado was passed to private ownership and local public and state ownership, right? But we have this, I'm going to call it a healthy mix of preserved federal lands and private lands, and public lands that are owned by public agencies, right? So, recreation on these rivers is a huge thing. And who would have believed in the 2001, 2002 drought that the legislature would actually pass a kayak course law? You know? John Wesley Powell is often misquoted, but he often said, now this is what he really said, folks, that if you took all the water out of all the streams in the West, you could only irrigate 5% of the land that can be irrigated, all right? He wasn't an in-stream flow guy. He was a perpetual agrarian who believed in the settlement of the West and exploring it and studying the native tribes and all those wonderful things. But when it came to water, he thought the water would be best used, taken out of the streams and put on farms. So just like Thomas Jefferson, who never got beyond the Blue Ridge, Jefferson was a perpetual agrarian democracy, farm ground oriented person. They thought that was going to be the future of the West. Well, of course, we're the most populous, area of the entire country, and there's no reason why that is except for the sunshine and the great mountains and 1/3 plains, 1/3 mountains, 1/3 canyon, and then the four corners. I mean, we have nothing to see or do out here. And everybody else wants a piece of it, right? So, this is Colorado. And there you go, the Great Sand Dunes, a national monument and then a national park. There is Bob Maughan, who was a ranger at the Philmont Scout Ranch where I met my wife in the 60s, between Raton and Taos, the Philmont Scout Ranch and the National Boy Scout Camp. We were on the camp staff together down there, and that's how I learned about the sangres, which rise up right behind Philmont. But this is the sand dunes back in, I'm going to say the early 80s, with our friend Bob Maughan and our great hiking dog Pepsi. So, these water facilities that cut across the valley. This, if I remember, is a March trip some years ago. And there are the sprinklers, all quiet, waiting for the summer season. Nice mantle of snow up there. Oh, what's that, Blanca, huh? Holy mackerel, what a, sacred to the Navajos. The Navajo sacred peaks, 2 of them are in Colorado. Blanca and Hesperus. And the other 2 are in Mount Taylor in New Mexico and the San Francisco Peaks. So the Navajo view of their homeland includes parts of Colorado. This is the compacts map. These are the interstate compacts that we entered into to share the waters of the interstate streams. We learned, actually, despite claiming that we owned all the water, that we had to share it with downstream states. Because the United States Supreme Court has jurisdiction to divide the waters between upstream and downstream states. But you can see here the reach of Colorado all the way to the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Cortez. Now tell me if that isn't the best part of the entire world. You know, right there we're looking at. But seriously, we thought when we entered the Union that we owned all the water, and we got disabused of that notion. We can only consume 1/3 of the water that arises in Colorado because of 9 interstate compacts, and because we couldn't agree with Wyoming and Nebraska on a division of waters of the Laramie and North Platte, which arise in Colorado. Don't forget that. Lots of people forget that. You know, our water administrators have to abide by these 2 equitable apportionment decrees of the U.S. Supreme Court and the 9 interstate compacts. So this is actually the inset map for the Citizens Guide to Colorado's Interstate Compacts, one of the 10 guides you can get through the Water Education Colorado. Now there's how we got formed, and it's very important to understand this. And coming from the San Luis Valley, you know this better than most Coloradans, but I just want to refresh you on the history of this. So the 13 colonies, states come out of revolution against Britain, basically, colonial revolution. 1803, Louisiana Purchase. You know, France and Spain are trading it across, and Jefferson for $15 million ends up buying it. And the Louisiana Purchase goes up the Arkansas, everything from the north bank of the Arkansas to the divide to Montana, okay? The Louisiana Purchase. The Oregon Treaty of 1845, does that say 45 or 46? 46 maybe. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, and prior to that, Texas, of course, broke away from Mexico, the Texas annexation. So 65% of Mexico was annexed into the United States by the Texas annexation and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so that's moving jurisdictional boundaries. Remember, these treaties are with foreign countries. They weren't made with the citizens that were already living here. I call them citizens now because finally the United States recognized the tribes and the Hispano people who were here prior to these additions to the United States. It's very important in Colorado that we know and acknowledge our history and our peoples. Florida too. Of course, we annexed pieces of Spanish Florida. All right, so this is Mexico before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, coming up into our country, everything from the south bank of the Arkansas out to the Pacific coast. This is Pike, 1906. Jefferson has sent Lewis and Clark out, and then he sends Pike out, right? So Pike comes into this country and gets lost, right? He comes over the Sangres and ends up in Spanish territory. This is before the Mexican Revolution, and he gets arrested and taken to Mexico City. Jared Orsi, who is a professor at CSU, has written a very wonderful biography of Pike. I highly recommend it to you. And then, of course, we've got Long's expedition of 1820, and he was real impressed with his country too. Both of these U.S. explorers called it the Great American Desert. It is, isn't it? Just take a look outside here. You live in it. Huh? What do you have, 7 inches of precipitation a year on the valley floor? If that isn't the Great American Desert, these guys weren't wrong. They just weren't right, you know, because of the way we can manage and use and share water. Southwestern part of Colorado, this is Ricky Hayes of the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. How many of you have been into the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Park, right? The other half of Mesa Verde, and you can get a guide from Tawak for a half day or full day, go in and see petroglyphs, cliff houses, etc., and not sit behind one diesel bus, okay? I'm showing this great panel to you here that's on the floor of the Mancos Canyon in the Ute Tribal Park. So right under Ricky's chin, I want to point out rain cloud with her butterfly wings and Kokopelli, right? Kokopelli's on his back. And what's Kokopelli's job is to make sweet music to rain cloud, so the rain cloud will drop the precious rain. These were dryland corn farmers, and they also domesticated turkey, so they fed the corn to the turkey. Look at this beautiful representation. The Hopi came up to teach the Utes how to interpret these symbols, and Ricky Hayes does a great job as a guide explaining this. What you see, here's rain dropping here. In a real dry year, that's a verga. Is that how you pronounce it? The rain doesn't hit the ground? That's a disaster. That's called disaster. We had one of those last year, where basically, was drought, drought, drought. So there the people come out from the lake in the center of the earth into what the Navajos still call the glittering world, the world of light, the fourth world. And this is the Sipapu, of course. And you can see the people coming out of the earth itself into the surface. That is the Ute presence in their historical times. They roamed from the west slope to the east slope to hunt buffalo. So that is their historical homeland and hunting grounds as well. Now this is Farview Village on Chapin Mesa. How many of you have been here? You go to Spruce Tree House in the museum. If you stop before all of that, you can go to the Farview Village. And I want to point out this symbol. Anybody want to interpret that for me? Huh? This is a kiva, by the way. You could live in here during the harsh winter conditions. Remember, it has an air shaft and a bench down here, deflector stone, deflects the air, and then this was logged and thatched, and there was a ladder coming down into it. So they use these as dwelling places in the harsh wintertime. But how about interpreting this symbol? Anybody? Just take a guess. John Keenhold, I know I've told you about this 1,000 times, but I hope you don't speak up and interpret this. Thank you, Judge Keenhold and Judge Swift, for being here in the audience tonight, by the way. And it's a privilege to have served with you. What is this? Okay, I would say it's a symbol of a spring. It's also the circumference of the migration of the people who come out of the center of the earth, right? So what is a spring? Hydrological, how many of you are engineers, studied hydrologic science, right? Right? A spring is, Leroy? A spring is? Or an unconfined source. It's a place where the tributary groundwater to a river system intercepts the surface. Okay, I'm going to use that as a functional definition of it. And these people had to depend on springs, right? And from the Farview Village, there's a spring a mile north and a mile and a half south, and you would take your 5-gallon water jar. Water is pretty heavy. Yucca fiber and a deer skin here to hold it on your head and put it on your back. And you imagine now what governance is like when you have to decide who the water haulers are going to be and who gets to use the water. This is precious water. Here's a reservoir sitting 100 yards from the Farview Village. And this is an ingenious reservoir because it's a mesa top reservoir. The people, these are clay soils. They would stamp down the clay soils. They build interceptor ditches. They run a domestic water supply here. It's too precious, remember. They're dryland corn farmers. And so they have to have some governance mechanism here about when you can take water for drinking water to go to the Farview Village, right? And who gets to do it and how often. I don't think water law is anything more than the customs and values of the people around the most precious resource we have and deciding how we must share it or fight over it. There have been 8 reservoirs found in Mesa Verde, both mesa top and in the canyon bottoms. right? So these are water workers. They're structure builders. You know how engineers are, right? So the civil engineering profession has a monument here, and it says, well, one of the oldest water structures in the Americas. Okay, well, okay. We needed to be told that, right? So the oldest ones are actually 20 hand-dug wells about 12,000 years old outside of Clovis, New Mexico. And it's possible to dig down 10 feet with, remember what they had here now, right? Sticks, working stones tied on sticks as tools, pots, baskets, and so on to clear the sediment out. Now, some of these reservoirs lasted 350 years till they got sedimented in. This is, by the way, I donated all my map collection, which I obtained in Taos at the Robinson Map Shop and the old map gallery in Denver, to the Supreme Court, and they're on the walls of the 4-story courthouse there in Denver, the new one, and also some of them in trays. This is the Wilkes map of 1841, and this is really an interesting map because Wilkes was a Navy captain who sailed the Pacific coast to survey it. Not an inch of the Pacific coast was in American hands. I should say United States hands. When I was a Peace Corps volunteer, my wife and I we served in Bogota, and I got off the plane the first day, embarrassed myself, and I said, "We're from America." And guess what they said? We are too. You know, there's a South American, a Central American, a North American. You're from North America. Thanks for visiting us. You make that mistake about once. Okay? So Mexico is a North American country, and Wilkes is sailing the Pacific coast here, and he pretty much describes it pretty well because he can see it. And, you know, he's a surveyor. But he gets this all wrong. The great Rocky Mountain interior, he gets it all wrong. Huh? Got the Rocky Mountains going straight down here, the Colorado River somewhere going straight down here, and you know, the Rockies are here, I guess. Who knows? The only real good detail is up here in the northwest corner where South Pass is, in Wyoming, northern Colorado, the Poudre River, the headwaters of the Green River. And how did the U.S. map makers know about this? They got it from the fur traders who got it from the Native Americans. You know, the South Pass is the low break in the whole Continental Divide. That's where the railroad went in 1862 because of this. So, of course, John Wesley Powell becomes the surveyor of the Colorado Plateau, and Clarence King is the surveyor of the 40th parallel across the Great Basin. And Lieutenant Wheeler is the surveyor of the Southwest. And Ferdinand Hayden is the surveyor of Colorado and Wyoming. They were doing these great surveys, you know, in the 1860s, 1870s, to map what is now in United States territory by that time. So this is the public domain, and it's absolutely essential that we grasp what the public domain is. And this actually includes the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Constitution recognized slavery. Slaves were property, remember, to get the original North-South together. But those founding persons had the Northwest Territory, which Virginia had claimed, released and proclaimed it to be anti-slavery, free soil country. Now we're talking about Indiana, Ohio, that country in the Northwest Ordinance is in the public domain. Now, what is the public domain? The public domain was everything that Congress had control over under the property clause of the United States Constitution to decide who could use it and under what kind of circumstances. And so the Homestead Act of 1862, right, and the Union Congress allowed you to settle on 160 acres of land. If you stuck there for 5 years, you could get a title or patent to the surface. But in the 1866 Mining Act, the Congress severed the water on the public domain for the use of the states and territories to determine their water laws and to allocate the water. It was on the public domain. So Texas wasn't public domain land, remember? It came in as a separate, it proclaimed itself a separate republic. And so when it came into the United States, it came in with very little public land. I think that less than 2% of the land in Texas is publicly owned. Some of you probably know that better than I do, but you know, the public domain does not include Texas, right? All right, so here's Long's Great American Desert. Huh? Great American Desert. He comes out here in 1820 in August, and the snow melt had already blown through. And he sees a plat that's like, and Mark Twain talks about how puny the plat was and what a sick little river it is. But he saw it in August. He didn't see it in the snow melt. Bent's Fort, you well know this, on the north side of the Arkansas under the Louisiana Purchase is an American territory. The Arkansas River, braided channel out on the plains, certainly different from the Arkansas that starts up in Leadville, right? It's like two different rivers. We tried to convince the U.S. Supreme Court of that in the Arkansas v. Colorado case, and they didn't buy it. Remember, our theory as Coloradans was, well, there's always going to be enough return flow for you downstream states, right? Always going to be enough coming from irrigating the crops and going through sewage treatment systems and so on. So don't worry about us. We can't use it all. What do you think they said to that? They sued us over the Arkansas River and the Laramie River, right? The Arkansas River in 1902 and the Laramie River in 1911. This is three compilations of Fremont expedition. John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder, right? So 1842, 1843, and 1845. He is surveying the route up the North Platte, the route up the Arkansas. He's surveying North Park, Middle Park, South Park. He sees the snow melt in 1843, and he writes in a U.S. government report, Major Long was wrong. There is water here during the snow melt, and there is area that can be irrigated. There are fertile lands out here. All they need is the water. But notice who's in control here now, 1845. Sioux, the Arapaho and Cheyenne, the Kiowa and the Comanche. These historical maps are still, landmen and women, realtors, historians, and I think just you and I need to look at these maps and realize where we came from, who we are. Who Coloradans are is the primary question. And what do we do about that? What is this? San Luis Peoples Ditch, 1852. The oldest continuous water right. Colorado Territory does not exist when this is built on the Sangre de Cristo land grant. Of course, the Sangres, the Culebra River Basin. No Colorado, I'm sorry to report, huh? This is the mid-1850s. This is a great shock. First time I saw this, I said, cannot be correct. Utah comes to the divide? What is that about? We're out. Hey, we're Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Utah. We're anything but Colorado, the jurisdiction. We're Colorado, but we're not the jurisdiction of Colorado. So then the gold rush of 1858, it changes everything. And they come piling out here in 1859, and here's the guy who's the pivotal person. Lincoln runs on the Republican platform of 1860 on delivery of three acts he promises. The Homestead Act of 1862, the Railroad Act of 1862, and the Land Grant College Act, CSU and others, of 1862, all delivered by the Union Congress. He was a great infrastructure builder. He was a railroad attorney in Illinois. He was a Westerner. It's perched out on the frontier there. What's his fundamental proposition? He's opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories and states. Opposed. This causes the Civil War. Colorado is at the fulcrum of the Civil War because the question is, shall the new Western territories be slavery-free? And Lincoln's position on this was well known. So this is the land office map of 1902, and I think it's the best snapshot of who we are as Coloradans. Now, if you look up here, there's a red dot, say it's Sterling. That's where you went in to get your patent, your title to 160 acres of the surface if you stuck on that farm for 5 years. All right? There's the Mexican land grants. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we had to recognize these. The Sangre de Cristo, the Baca, the Ville, St. Vrain, the Bobian, Miranda cutting across southern Colorado. We had to recognize the rights of the people in possession, settlement of the land grants. All right? The original Ute Reservation went up to the White River. There were 7 bands of Utes here, and that's about a third of Colorado by the Treaty of 1868. All right? The Utes lost this. When the gold was discovered in the San Juans, they ceded this in the Bruno Cession to propitiate the miners, and never was the U.S. able to enforce the treaty obligation to keep non-natives off of reservations, particularly when gold and silver were discovered. What else do we have on this map? The rise of the original national forests. This is hugely important to Colorado. The biggest one is that White River National Forest, still one of the biggest national forest reservations ever created. This was created by Benjamin Harrison, President Harrison, in 1891. And who was pushing for these national forests? The farmers and the new towns. What lies below the national forests? The ditches. The reservoirs are being built up in the forest, right? Because that 1866 Mining Act gave a right-of-way to anybody who wanted to locate a ditch or reservoir up in the forest. So you could occupy federally owned land with diversion and storage structures. And, we have this wonderful topography that produces the snow and the snow melt. And Coloradans pretty much figured out that if you kept piecing up the national forests into homesteads and having it all timbered and go to private possession, that this national sponge, this ability for the snow melt to sink in and become part of the tributary groundwater that feeds the surface stream at other parts of the year would be lost. So Coloradans supported the creation of the national forest, although some of us didn't like the enduring federal presence, and it's still a controversy, is it not? But, our ski areas are located up on that White River Reserve, most of them, that was created in 1891. Now, it was Teddy Roosevelt who really filled out this 14 million acres for Colorado, but Benjamin Harrison should get credit for starting this. So the shape and feel of Colorado. Now, here's the main thing. Notice who our neighbors are when Colorado Territory is created in the second week of February 1861. Kansas becomes a state in the first week of February of 1861. Colorado then follows immediately, becomes a territory. All right? Kansas didn't know what to do with these rough-housing men, they were mostly men, up in the gold fields, right? And it wants to become a legitimate state, and this is a madhouse out here, or whatever they called it, uncivilized. So we were carved in this trapezoidal fashion out of Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Utah. Now Utah, and this, sometimes justice catches up. Utah is shoved back to where it belongs. So that we can take care of it. But what was our first job? Is to stop the Texas Confederates who did try to invade the gold fields. And our farmers and miners joined this volunteer militia, descend upon the wagon train outside of Glorieta Pass, kill every horse and mule, and burn all the supplies in the wagons, and send the Texas Confederates back to Texas on their feet. But what did we get out of this? We became the mother of rivers, right? Because this is the way we're carved to hold the gold fields. Why is that? Remember, the divide comes out of Wyoming, goes through Rocky Mountain National Park, takes a bend at the Collegiate Peaks, goes down towards Silverton, doubles back above Durango, comes to Wolf Creek Pass right above you all, and plunges down into New Mexico. That was the country the Union Congress is trying to preserve for the Union. That's why we got this. That's why we got the St. Louis Valley. Huh? Because the San Juans go down there, and the Sangres, who knows what would be in there, you know. We got the headwaters of the Platte, the Republican. We always forget about the East Slope Republican River because we like to argue across the divide with each other. And we put our tail on the eastern plains. And the Republican River rises out of the eastern plains, out of groundwater, and goes into Nebraska and Kansas. So go with me again clockwise. The North Platte and the South Platte join below, in Nebraska at Lake McConaughey, right? But the headwaters are in Colorado, the Platte River system, North Platte, South Platte. The Republican, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, your country, and then the West Slope tributaries to the Colorado River, San Juan, the Dolores, you know them, the main stem, Colorado, the white, the green. This is the Colorado we love and everybody else loves too. All right, these happy irrigators. This is Harper's Weekly. It billed itself as the Journal of Civilization. See, that's June of 1874. These are the happy irrigators at the Union Colony, which was founded near the confluence of the Poudre and the South Platte in 1870. We now know it as Greeley. They built 2 ditches, all right? Just happy as a lark. But what happens is that in August, 2 months after the publication of this nice photo showing the flume and the happy irrigators, it's paradise, isn't it? The 2 new ditches at Camp Collins, now a surplus Army camp by this time, intercept in 1874 all the water of the Poudre River and dry up Greeley. Guess what they thought down in Greeley? They were ex-Civil War soldiers, and they packed their guns up to the Eaton Courthouse, and they said, put the river back. Can't you see? We were here first. We were here first. How can you just build ditches up above other ditches and intercept the whole flow became the issue for the Constitutional Convention of 1876, 2 years after this Fort Collins Union Colony dispute. Now there's the number 3 ditch at Greeley, still in action there. And what do we like to do along any waterway? You know, a ditch, a creek. Does anybody out here really think we have actual rivers compared to the Potomac and the Hudson and the rest of that? But my point is that any place there is water moving, we want to be moving along with it. And I used to think that, you know, I still do actually. If you go along any of these water bodies that flow, what do you hear? You hear the ancestors right underneath the surface of the water speaking to you. Aren't there voices there? I mean, the bubbling of the voices. Water is alive. It flows through us. We are water creatures. The earth is, if we didn't have the water, we wouldn't be here, and neither would all the creatures be that we share with. Now, so this is the 1876 Constitution, and there was an alliance between the Hispano-Southern Colorado and the Northern Colorado non-Hispano irrigators in the Constitutional Convention's Water Committee that came up with this language. So let's just go over it. It's very economical, but there were many drafts in the Constitutional Convention that came up with this. So what is it? The water of every natural stream. What is a natural stream? The original draft of the constitutional bill first put on the table was stream. Could mean surface stream, right? That says natural stream. What the people were seeing on the Poudre was that when you irrigate land, you know, the crop only consumes 40 to 50% of it. It was coming back through the downstream banks of the stream in August and September, the low flow times. Where was it coming from? Well, they weren't brainless. Colorado water law grew from the ground up. I've already showed you that with Mesa Verde and San Luis Peoples Ditch and the rest of it. So they saw this phenomenon of return flow. So the natural stream is the tributary groundwater and the surface water, the co-joined body of a stream that also includes being fed by surface water, groundwater intermixed. water applied to farms, in cities, returned through wastewater treatment plants or whatever. So the law of Colorado is you can only use the water, the native water of a basin one time, and you need to return it because it's been appropriated. Time and time again, these return flows have been appropriated. Now, there's the second phrase that's extremely important. Not heretofore appropriated. This is 1876, so they're recognizing prior appropriation. Do they stop with the 1861 Colorado Territory? No. The Hispano ditches are in place. And those people at the convention from southern Colorado, from the San Luis Valley, make sure that you can only appropriate unappropriated water. If it's already appropriated, it belongs to the person who put it to beneficial use first. Is hereby declared to be the property of the public. Now, the original constitutional draft that I was referring to says the state. They changed that. They changed it from the state to the public. Why did they do that? What's that? Because they didn't want the legislature deciding from time to time who could appropriate the water. It arose on the public domain, remember? The 1866 Mining Act was also retroactive, and the U.S. Supreme Court has said this, to prior appropriations that existed before the 1866 Mining Act. So it's the property of the public so that the public, when the public appropriates it, the legislature can't reallocate it, reappropriate it, take it without just compensation. I don't need to preach to you. You know how this works. First in time, first in right for actual beneficial use, right? Property of the public, dedicated to the use of the people of the state. Now that's where state comes in, right? The public owns it. The people of the state can appropriate it. All right, now, so this is a 2001 decision. Empire Lodge became very controversial when the drought hit in 2002, 2003. This was actually an Arkansas River Division II surface water case where a homeowners organization had been left with a lake, an artificial lake, with, as it turns out, no water right. But they thought, this is what happens when developments occur. You see this nice lake, you buy into it, you're not worried about whether there's water right or not, and then you find out when there's a drought that the state engineer, the division engineer, and the water commissioners come knocking on the door, and they say that you do not have a decree to divert. Now, under free river conditions, anybody can divert at any time, right? Doctrine of prior appropriation is a doctrine of scarcity, right? The seniors get served first for actual need and beneficial use in accordance with their adjudicated priority, because in 1879, the legislature, 3 years after statehood, puts in the courts the authority to adjudicate the priority date of water rights. Now, a water court decree has 4 main incidents to it, right? You know this from looking at your own decrees, right? The point of diversion, the amount of diversion, the type of use, and the place of use. That's in this decree. And the water officials, the state engineer is convening here, right, tomorrow morning. The water officials enforce this. We believe in this doctrine. We enforce it because it's our most valuable resource. So the water courts adjudicate the water rights and the priorities. The state engineer, division engineers, and water commissioners administer the waters of the natural stream in accordance with the judicial decrees and the statutory codes. Now you notice the symmetry of this? Separation of powers, right? Right? The legislature can adopt the codes subject to the Constitution. The judiciary interprets based on a case-by-case decision-making basis who's entitled to a water right, where, when, how, under what conditions, and fixes the decree for that. the engineers, the executive branch enforce it. So we believe in the rule of law involving the three branches of government in Colorado, right? Going right back to statehood. And now, of course, who owns the aquifer becomes a question. We had this case up in Park County, South Park. And Aurora wanted to make some diversions of the tributary groundwater and use the aquifer up there. And the homeowners took the position that the overlying service owner owned the aquifer. Yeah, that it was a trespass for water to be put in there and shepherded through, right? And claimed by somebody else. This is the law of Texas. The law of Texas is the rule of capture. The law of Texas recognizes the old common law that went up to the heavens, down to the surface of the earth, down to the far reaches of the earth, right? Check your common law. Texans can pump water regardless of its impact on their neighbors or the surface stream because it's the rule of capture and possession. We don't recognize that. We recognize that the tributary groundwater is part of the surface stream and is subject to prior appropriation, all right? So we determined that this claim of the overlying landowners to own the aquifer was not correct. And that under the law of Colorado, this public resource, the aquifers are in ownership of the state and the people as a public resource, for the use of the people. Now, of course, if you want to go onto somebody's land and drill a well or build a ditch, there's a provision in the Constitution that allows a private right of compensation, right? Condemnation with just compensation to do that. We have that in the Constitution. I didn't show you that, Section 7 of Article 16, but you can build a ditch across somebody else's property if you pay just compensation, if you don't already have a right-of-way under the 1866 Act or by way of necessity or any of this, all right? So remember, you cannot get water to your location even if you have a water use right unless you can cross the intervening public or private lands, correct? Huh? So our law, going back to 1861, the territorial law recognized the right of ditch owners to go across intervening lands with the ditch to take water to wherever it was needed for beneficial use. The law of the East was riparian law, and only the owners of the banks of the stream could divert any water, and then they could only divert it in a de minimis fashion because downstream and upstream riparian owners have a correlative right to the flow of the water. Now that's the old water wheel, mill pond, grist mill, sawmill, lumber mill. You see it in the East where there's water just diverted through a mill pond, tail race, etc. It was water power. So the correlative rights of the riparians were totally abolished in Colorado by the 1876 Constitution because people feared the railroads and the corporate monopolies were going to buy up the land along the stream and block the use of water by those farmers and growing cities that needed it. So the people that were very strong in the Constitutional Convention in Colorado also included members of the Grange. And the Grange was an agrarian movement that was anti-corporate, anti-monopoly, anti-speculation. So we still have this in our law. You can't speculate in water, right? You have to have an actual need for it. And if you want to change your water right, you have to go back to court, get a change of water right decree, find out, determine what the representative historical consumptive use is of the burden that was put on the public's water resource, which is the amount consumed, because it doesn't include the return flows. The return flows have been appropriated. Exception to this. You take water from another basin, doesn't have any return flows to that basin, you can take it to 100% through. That's why we have discussions between the East Slope and West Slope. You can use imported water 100% consumptively. Use, reuse, pledge it to augmentation plans to cover out of priority diversions, by putting water back in the stream for the seniors. But native water you can only have one appropriation for, okay? unless you notice that in the outset that you're intending to appropriate the return flows. Now, that is happening in recent times, but you know, all these other rights are junior now, and mostly the 3 eastern slope streams, which includes the Rio Grande. Rio Grande is eastern slope stream. I'm sorry, folks, that's just the way it is. The flag is there, right? All right, so this is a 1890 survey by the United States agriculture folks showing the patterns of settlement here. 1890s, now this is the Newell report, the Newell map. And you see where the location of the water development is? Platte, the Poudre, the South Platte. You got down a string of the Arkansas River. You got the San Luis Valley up. The West Slope, hardly any. Why? It was in an Indian reservation, the Ute Reservation. The Ute Reservation wasn't shrunk until 1880 after Nathan Meeker, who founded the Union Colony, was killed by the Utes because he tried to turn them into ditch diggers and plowed up their horse track and called in the army when they weren't listening to him. And as soon as the army came in, the Utes started shooting at the soldiers, killed Nathan Meeker, and they lost everything from Ouray to the White River. Those 4 bands were pushed out to Utah. That's why we just have the Ute, Mountain Ute, and Southern Ute, and 3 bands on the southwest part of Colorado. But it's interesting to see. Now, this isn't that long ago, you know, 1890s here, where the development is. Very little on the western slope, of course, and I just explained to you. You couldn't go on to an Indian reservation and have a homestead. It was reserved land. There in our courthouse are Ignacio and Buckskin Charlie, chosen by the Utes and the Ute Mountain Utes to represent the fact that there was an 1868 reservation for the Utes. This is very important because in 1908, the United States Supreme Court decides in a Montana case, the Winters case, that on the date these reservations were reserved for the Indians, since they had to cede everything else, they got a reserved water right for then unappropriated water for the future of their homeland, right? So the prior appropriation rights are junior to the Utes' 1868 right. And there you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico cedes lands that later became part of the Colorado Territory. Consistent with the U.S. Constitution, the treaty recognizes property and citizenship rights for Hispanic settlers on these lands. The rule of law, right? This is in our Learning Center, 4,000 square feet in the Ralph Carr Learning Center. Separation of powers, guaranteed individual rights, the Bill of Rights, due process, and equal protection of the laws. The last 2 are the Civil War amendments, right? This was what the Civil War was about. This was Lincoln's stance, right? 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment provides for due process and equal protection. The 15th Amendment allows the black former male slaves to vote. It took women until the 1920s to get the right to vote nationwide, although Wyoming and Colorado were earlier in the 1880s. What is this about? Due process and equal protection doesn't apparently include women with the right to vote. You know, so we so what do they have to do? Well, they exercise the First Amendment, and they have a nationwide campaign for the amendment that gets passed in 1920, which we seem to reinvent ourselves and have to reinvent ourselves, even though you would think that if you read these provisions literally, these Civil War amendments, of course, there ought to be equal rights and due process and all of this. Now, of course, the administrators get busy here, and they have these water commissioner districts. This is your Division 3, right? But they have these little sub-administration water districts that they had in the old day. This is the 1908 biennial report of the state engineer. It has a lot of wonderful maps in it. The water districts, where the water commissioners still recognized to do their enforcement work. This is a 2003. It's in the drought, and this is up on the San Luis Peoples Ditch. And these 2 gentlemen are showing Carla Brown and me. And remember, the Water Foundation had started up in 2002. We get a tour of the San Luis Peoples Ditch and the laterals here. This is your county commissioner, now gone. His name is, yes, showing us around. Carla Brown, first director of the Colorado Foundation for Water Education, and a padlock, which you know, if you're out of priority and there's not enough water, the water commissioner can padlock the gate, and if you bust if you bust the lock, triple penalties, injunction, et cetera. Some of this happened in the South Platte River Basin in the well crisis, because these wells up there were sunk in the 30s and the 50s, 1930s and 1950s, and are junior to the surface water rights that are being shut down in 2002, 2003, curtailed back to 1861 rights. So when you got irrigating a circle and you're not replacing the depletions to the stream, you're subject to enforcement. That's the Constitution. That's the laws. That's what we bought for ourselves, right? This is what we live by. All right, this is the Rio Grande Reservoir, old photo, just been built. J.C. Ulrich was the engineer. How many of you went to that ceremony, 2012? Yeah? The 100-year anniversary of it? There's J.C. Ulrich, 2012, at the Rio Grande Reservoir. What a dude. Okay, so I put on a costume. They wanted me to be J.C. Ulrich there, so there I am. Engineer for the Rio Grande. I'm over 100 there. And Rio. Always packing the camera, aren't you? All right, so the Subdistrict 1, the 2011 case, which I authored, of course, with concurrence of all the members of the court. This upholds your subdistrict there, north of the Rio Grande. Very innovative plan to try to sustain the aquifer within some limits and retire ground, and also pay back the river for the senior rights, if any, that need to be compensated for. In other words, replacement water provided. Aquifer systems are going to be maintained at sustainable levels. This was very innovative legislation. After the well crisis in the South Platte, people of the San Luis Valley realized they needed to do something down here, or their wells would be shut down one by one. And that's how these sub-districts started to be formed. And I authored this opinion that came up from Judge Keenhold. And Judge Swift has had the subsequent cases in front of her. These are both great judges. It's a pleasure as a Supreme Court Justice for the time I served to review the findings of fact, conclusions of law, orders, decrees, rulemaking proceedings of fine judges like Judge Keenhold and Judge Swift, but I include the other water judges throughout the state in our 7 water divisions. The Rio Grande watershed, you know this, it's a complicated system. You've had efforts to remove the water from the San Luis Valley. So far that has not happened. There are mechanisms in water court and in the rules of regulations that follow what the legislature intended here. And so again, this is explaining the aquifers, the confined, the unconfined. The cases really define that better. Here's our challenge, right? 2050, population is expected to double. When I came out of law school, the population of Colorado, this was 1971, was 2 million. Today it's about 5.5 million. We have the same basic water supply that the ancestral Puebloans had. So we got to manage it carefully, manage it well, and address the needs of those who want to be Coloradans. Now I'm asking you, who is a Coloradan? Senator Crowder. Rest of you want to claim that you're Coloradans? I certainly am. I grew up in an Air Force family, went to 12 schools before I landed here. I'm a Coloradan. Anybody who wants to move here and live here is a Coloradan. Look at this. Texas bought back Crested Butte. If you went back to this early map, you would see that stovepipe coming up out of Texas, They were claiming up through Breckenridge, Crested Butte and Breckenridge, and the Congress actually paid Texas $10 million in 1850 to release this. They thought the Rio Grande ran up to Breckenridge. They didn't know what they were talking about. But you remember those bumper stickers? Go back to Texas. Don't Californicate Colorado, right? We had a couple of deep dives in our economy and decided that that really wasn't what the message that we wanted to convey. When I look at it, it says native on a license plate, I look for whether they're Ute or Arapaho or Cheyenne. Don't you? Or Hispano. Colorado's water plan. This is an aspirational plan. You know, we've got these 9 round tables here that we've divided ourselves into. Try to look at our local needs, what we see for the future, what kind of mixes of water use we want. But remember, the Constitution has not been repealed. There's one Colorado and one Constitution, and plenty of arguments, right? So, divide. The mystery of a divide is this. You can stand on opposites and not lose your balance. Draw a straight line from the sky through the middle of your forehead. Half of you belongs to the other ocean. Atlantic, Pacific. Half your mind and half your heart, you share downstream equally and never drift apart. When you're up there in that high mountain altitude, you cannot tell where that water is flowing, the Atlantic or the Pacific, right? This is Colorado. This is us. We are the state of the Great Divide. We live with it. We share it. We argue about it. So all of this is designed to see if we can't get along with each other and figure out how to preserve our open space farmland, how to have viable cities and commerce, how to have in-stream flows. I mean, 1973, we got an in-stream flow law, recreation for our people. Coloradans. To each of us, the land, the air, the water, mountain, canyon, mesa, plain, lightning bolts, clear days with no rain. At the source of all thirst, quenching hope. At the root and core of time and no time, the Great Divide community stands astride the backbone of the continent, gathering, draining, reflecting, sending forth a flow so powerful it seeps rhythmically from within, alive to each of us, to drink, to swim, to grow corn ears, to listen to our own children float the streams of their own magnificence, out of their seeping dreams, out of their useful silliness, out of their source mouths high and pure, the Great Divide. You and I, all that lives and floats and flies and passes through, all we know of why. Thanks for being here tonight. Appreciate it. Now, I'd entertain some questions, but I want you to know that I can't give you legal advice, and I'm not in politics. I'm still a judge. Subject to that, does anybody have any questions? Senator Crowder.
I have a question. You talked about the reservation water
Yeah.
under federal. Now, they still have to follow the same administration of the state of Colorado, correct? Well, what is the rule differences between the two?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's essential. So part of the 1969 Act was to take advantage of the 1952 McCarran Amendment, whereby Congress waives sovereign immunity for state courts to determine what the federal tribal reservation claims are. So we started adjudicating the federal claims to water rights as of 1969, right? So our water courts are open. We have these monthly resumes, and the federal government can claim reserve water rights. The tribes can claim tribal reserve water rights. In fact, the Utes did, but then determined that they were going to make an agreement for the building of the Night Horse Reservoir. above Durango for the Ute Mountain and Southern Ute, and some water for the Navajo, right? So it's a great thing to be a state judge, because coming before you, you have the federal claims. There was a massive claim filed for the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest, which Judge Berman of Water Division 1 denied, because the U.S. didn't prove that they had reserved all the water in the streams, because the proof showed that reservoirs and ditches were part of the 1897 Organic Act, so that the people of the West could develop water supplies, including with structures on the land. And so Judge Berman, sitting as a District Division 1 water judge in Greeley, in the South Platte Division, limits them to a certain amount of water for their campgrounds and other necessary facilities, all right? State judges determining federal water rights, tribal water rights, whereas if the Congress had not waived sovereign immunity, we would have all had to go to federal court. But that was what the founders in the 1969 Act really handed us in these 7 water divisions we have in Colorado, the ability to have a unitary system of determination and enforcement. Does that help?
Yeah, well, the way you're explaining it, even though the federal government basically owns the water right, or gave it to the Indians, tribes, it's still administered by the state of Colorado.
Yes. Yes, that is an accurate statement.
Anything else?
It's an accurate statement. They have to get a decree. All right? Now, there's some argument that they can police themselves on native lands. I think we have a good agreement between our water officials and the tribes in Colorado. And there was a settlement. And the Utes haven't pressed their 1868 right, or they would have usurped everybody in southwest Colorado. They didn't do that. The problem with the Native American water right is that the federal government didn't hold up on its trust responsibility. The tribes actually build water projects. They were building projects under the Reclamation Act, mostly from non-natives. Now, not exclusively. The Navajos got a irrigation project built by the federal government. Okay? But until the tribes got their own lawyers pressing, in court to recognize tribal rights, they were not being turned into wet water, and there's nothing like wet water. Reserve right is nothing unless the government puts some money into building the projects the Native Americans need, and that's happening all over the West in these Indian settlements. That's a great question. Question in the back?
The 1868, whatever it was called.
Reserve water right of the Utes?
I guess that was, I don't know what it was. It was about that any water that wasn't pre-appropriated, any river or stream or water that wasn't pre-appropriated will now become federal water?
No. Our law still operates. If it's unappropriated water and it's within our compact allocation, you can appropriate it.
Well, it was the public lands map you showed, and you said, basically they said anything that was not pre-appropriated was now, I thought you said. Public land. Public land, I guess that was what.
I showed you the public domain,
Yeah, public domain.
out of which 2/3 of Colorado is ceded, out of the public domain for the founding of towns and cities and farm ground, etc. 1/3 remains. But the National Forest Organic Act of 1897 is very clear that the reservation of the forest was to assist the settlers of the West to have flows of water. And in U.S. v. New Mexico, the U.S. Supreme Court held the U.S. government did not have in-stream flows on the forest land because Congress didn't intend to reserve in-stream flows. Well, the government, the Justice Department, kept trying to do this anyway in Colorado under a number of theories. And that's why I complimented people like Dick Lamb and Hank Brown and others who saw in 1973 that we needed an in-stream flow law because people do not understand drying up of streams. It causes turmoil in their breasts and in their hearts, right? And we don't want it. We wanted control over our own water rights, so we had in-stream flows. And the power given to the Water Conservation Board, they now have 9,000 miles of in-stream flow rights, and they have 450 natural lake level rights. And they can acquire by lease or purchase senior water rights. Typically, agriculture has the senior rights because those were settled first to augment those flows. So do you see how we have tried to adjust to the environmental decade within our own water laws so we won't be usurped by the Federal Clean Water Act or claims for federal reservations, et cetera, et cetera? Question?
When it goes out, you said it went out of public domain into cities and stuff.
Yeah.
What domain is it under then? It's not public domain.
It's private land or it's municipal land, right? I mean,
Just the original question I wanted to get to was how much of the water was pre-appropriated to give an approximate before that thing came in and said, okay, it's all public domain. How much of it was pre-appropriated?
very little of it. Yes.
The waters of the U.S., I guess, problem, or I don't know what it's called, which one called, has that been settled now? Is that still up there in?
No, it's still in rulemaking, and that has to do with the regulatory authority of the Corps of Engineers. And waters of the U.S. has been debated since the Federal Clean Water Act of 1972 about what Congress meant. But you know, there is a substantial overlay to talk about this environmental piece that came in starting in 1969 with the National Environmental Policy Act, Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments in 1972, the Drinking Water Act, you know, all of this string of federal acts require, if you cross federal land, right, with any kind of facility, you really have to do a NEPA statement or show why you don't have to do a NEPA statement, right? So that has profoundly affected the ability to build and enlarge water projects. It does not affect our water rights, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, now, how you use a changed water right, if you have to build a reservoir to use it, you might have to cross federal ground because a third of it is still federal ground. You trigger all these environmental laws which have a lot of public process to them, and building a new reservoir like takes 18 to 20 years, you know, and the Two Forks for Denver got vetoed, right? Because people in Denver and people on the West Slope and people in northern Colorado didn't necessarily like 24 miles of that beautiful stream being dammed up. That was a seminal moment. Denver had never made any deal with the Western Slope, whereas the Northern District provided Green Mountain Reservoir through the Bureau of Reclamation for the Western Slope, and the Frying Pan, Arkansas project had Brudeye Reservoir for the Western Slope, and Denver never had anything like that. And then the Two Forks happened, and now they've been making agreements, because that's the way the world works these days. That's what these roundtables are about. That's what this public process is about. Yeah, question?
Ignorantly, I need to ask, with the scenario you've given us, where does our closed water basin project fit?
Your closed basin project has a decree, and it has a decree to take water out of north of the Rio Grande River and put it in the Rio Grande. Right? You're talking about the closed basin project, right? Do you have a further question on that?
I think it's much more complicated than that.
But there's a decree for it. It produced less water than what the Bureau of Reclamation thought the closed basin project was going to produce. Turns out that the aquifers are a lot more complicated than people thought they were. And that's the reason for you have very particular laws for the San Luis Valley that don't apply in other basins in the state, because the legislature has provided those, and the people of San Luis Valley has asked for those. And the people of San Luis Valley are paying money out of their own pockets to try to sustain the aquifers to a reasonable level, and we have an interstate compact with New Mexico and Texas that controls how much water can be used up in our part of the world, Colorado, that puts some severe kinds of peculiar restraints. In good water years, we send it downstream to them. We were largely in debt because we had oversubscribed it, and then frankly, we got a very good year, and the debt was canceled under the compact when Elephant Butte Reservoir filled. I mean, it was a miracle. God forgave us. Thank you.